Council of the United Nations adopted Resolution 660, the first of 12 resolutions that would culminate nearly 4 months later with Resolution 678. This authorized member states to use all necessary means to enforce the decisions of the United Nations. Canada acted deliberately and without undue delay.
Efforts to bring those violations to an end.
The Navy was called upon first. 2 destroyers, HMC ships Athabaskan and Terra Nova, and an operational support ship, HMCS Protecteur, would leave for the Arabian Gulf as soon as they could be refitted. Dockyard workers and Navy personnel alike worked round the clock through the first weeks of August, getting the ships ready for sea. Installing modern close-in weapons systems, old but reliable Bofors anti-aircraft guns, Harpoon ship-to-ship missile launchers, and up-to-date Shield chaff launchers. Sea King helicopters were equipped with the forward-looking infrared, or FLIR system. Members of the Royal Canadian Artillery, along with their blowpipe and Javelin missiles, also joined the ships. Commodore Ken Summers was put in command of the task group, hoisting his pennant in Athabaskan. The flagship, along with Terra Nova and Protecteur, were now designated Canadian Task Group 302.3. The 3 ships left Halifax on the 24th of August. Commodore Summers' mission was clear: assist in deterring further Iraqi aggression by helping to impose economic sanctions. After a long and busy voyage, during which intensive workups were conducted, the task group arrived at Bahrain on September the 27th. Just a few days later, the ships embarked on their first operational patrol in the central area of the Arabian Gulf, monitoring and intercepting shipping inbound and outbound from Iraqi ports. They conducted their first boarding early in October. The ships of 14 nations took part in interdiction operations. Canada's warships made up only a small fraction of the force, but accounted for 25% of the total intercepts. By the end of hostilities, the task group had conducted nearly 1,900 interceptions and 22 boardings of suspect vessels. Unrelentingly demanding duty schedules, superior communications, constant training, and good seamanship, along with the night detection capabilities of the Sea King. All these factors and more accounted for this excellent record. Coincident with our ships arriving in the region, the government sent a tactical fighter squadron to the Gulf to provide air cover. On October the 6th, the CF-18s of 409 Squadron, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Ed Campbell, took off from their base in Baden-Solingen, Germany. A few hours later, they landed at a military airfield near Doha, the capital of Qatar, one of the small emirates on the western shore of the Gulf. This would be the Canadian Air Task Group Middle East base for the duration of operations in the Gulf. We shared the base with a U.S. Air Force F-16 fighter squadron. The first combat air patrol was flown the next day, October the 7th. The soldiers of Mike Company, 3rd Battalion Royal Canadian Regiment, based at Baden-Solingen, were also deployed to Qatar to provide base security. Inevitably, the Canadians immediately christened their new home Canada Dry. First 1, and then 2 a few weeks later, as they quickly outgrew their allotted space. They were dry in name and dry in nature. Tensions mounted through the fall. Commodore Summers and his staff established Canadian Forces Middle East headquarters among the docks on the waterfront of Manama City, Bahrain. By October the 27th, Personnel attached as support units had converted a dilapidated and run-down tugboat depot into a secure and efficient military facility. This was to be the site of the Joint Naval and Air Headquarters, which commanded all Canadian forces in theater. Accompanying support units and officers and members of the Royal Canadian Regiment, a new signals unit, 90 Canadian Headquarters and Signal Squadron, was established to provide advanced, secure, and clear communications within the operational area, and also with authorities in Canada. In mid-December, the pilots and ground crew of 409 Squadron handed over to their colleagues from 439 Squadron, with whom they normally share the base at Baden-Solingen, and departed for Germany. Lieutenant Colonel Don Matthews led 439 Tiger Squadron into Qatar. 150 CF personnel from Canadian Forces Base Cold Lake in Alberta flew in via Bahrain to augment the Air Task Group. As well, responsibility for base security was transferred to soldiers from the 1st Battalion Royal 22nd Regiment, the Vandus.
Le rôle de la compagnie C est de protéger les avions, le personnel ainsi que l'équipement de combat du groupe opérationnel aérien qui a été détaché ici à Doha au Qatar. La personne allait arrêter parce que c'est
At home, the first snows fell. In the Gulf, Christmas celebrations were muted and hurriedly observed. Only messages, cards, and greetings from home lightened the prevailing gloom.
The most important thing for the average person here is to have that contact with their families back home, and they are getting this here contact through mail and parcels.
No fanfares of peace heralded the new year, which commenced with an increasingly intransigent Baghdad. Intelligence reported that Iraqi forces occupying Kuwait were digging in. Republican Guard divisions deployed over the northern Kuwaiti borders. As Canadian servicemen and women waited out the final days, and families' anxieties deepened at home, feverish and increasingly urgent diplomatic efforts were mounted. But all of these foundered in the face of Saddam Hussein's tragically unimaginative appreciation of the scope and nature of his actions.
Britain's Foreign Secretary, Mr. Douglas Hurd,
11th hour hopes evaporated. It was the eve of war. Early in January, on the 11th, the Chief of the Defense Staff ordered the deployment of 6 more CF-18s from 416 Lynx Squadron in Cold Lake to the Gulf to augment our air forces there. This brought the total number of operational aircraft to 24. At the same time, one of our Boeing 707 air tankers was deployed. This would allow us to increase the combat radius of our aircraft, and we could also provide refueling to other Allied aircraft.
01 Parker, come up Ruby 1, Ruby 1. Contact left hose. Did he fall off or pull off? He was pulling off and departing aircraft. Okay, feel free to terminate right hose.
130 more personnel were attached in support. Hostilities commenced early on the morning of January the 17th. Out in the Gulf, sailors closed up at action stations. Personnel were informed that the flash message had been received. At Bahrain, the commander called his people in to brief them personally. Alert states were raised. All personnel took the first of many anti-nerve agent tablets.
No allergies, I guess. We're probably standing at a bit of a historic moment here right now. For those of you that are old enough to remember Walter Cronkite, we can only say, and you remember this, Chief, and you were there, okay? Back in, within the next hour, that there will be a massive attack on Kuwait and Iraq, and that will be roughly along the lines of a a major Tomahawk attack going in, followed by significant numbers of B-52 bombers, followed by many waves of attack aircraft going in.
Through advanced communications and command technology, our commanders could watch Tomahawk cruise missiles fly from the American battleships on their own monitors through the hours until dawn on that first day.
I must compliment the Allies last night. That was an awesome, totally impressive display of military professionalism against Iraq. It was just plain impressive.
Other members of the Canadian forces, however, made do with CNN, the American satellite news service, an element which added further to the strange atmosphere created by war unfolding on television screens in real time. It did not take long for Saddam Hussein to reply, modestly in comparative terms, but still to a degree that caused understandable concern both in theater and at home. The Iraqi Scuds began to fall, first on Tel Aviv, and then on targets to the south, in Saudi Arabia, and towards Bahrain and Qatar. Tactically, high-explosive warheads were not of great concern, but commanders and service people alike were concerned about the possibility of chemical, biological, and even nuclear warheads being delivered through these weapons. Highly sensitive sensors, which could detect chemicals and biological agents in the air, were deployed. For the Canadians' part, good training had been provided, and all were equipped with modern nerve and biological agent antidotes, as well as the latest chemical protection suits. No one went anywhere without the suit on their backs, and the gas mask slung around their waist. Up to this point, the primary role of our fighters had been to conduct combat air patrols in the Central Gulf, providing air cover to the Canadian Naval Task Group. But on January the 23rd, this role was expanded to include sweep and escort missions in support of other elements of Allied air forces. And at Canadian Air Task Group Middle East in Qatar, Colonel Romeo Lalonde controlled the innumerable details attached to getting the fighters in the air.
We negotiate the missions, we plan the missions, we task the squadron, and we keep track of them going airborne, coming back, whether they get refueled or not. We task the refuelers. We get transport airplanes in. We meet the airlift requirements, and basically take care of housing, feeding, clothing, weapons, security, ground ops, you name it. We are the headquarters. That's what goes on in this, we call it CCC, Canadian Command Center.
Canadian fighters undertook the first sweep and escort mission over enemy territory on January the 23rd. This was the first time that Canadian combat aircraft had flown operations over enemy territory since the Korean conflict. Lieutenant Colonel Matthews led the flight of 4 aircraft himself. Canadian pilots also took advantage of targets of opportunity beyond the formal scope of their tasking. Early in the morning of January the 30th, Captain Steve Hill and his wingman, Major Dave Kendall, engaged an enemy fast attack craft in the northern Gulf area with missile and cannon fire.
We inquired as to whether or not they had received any AAA fire, because that was our primary concern at that time, AAA being one of the primary threats to airmen, and they indicated in the negative that was the case. And we went in and identified the vessel and proceeded to attack it as was described in the earlier communique.
At sea, officers had worked around the clock, planning for all contingencies. When hostilities commenced, Captain Dusty Miller took the Canadian Task Group south to coordinate the newly formed Combat Logistic Force, a multinational force of up to 50 ships, flying 10 different ensigns. Captain Miller was responsible for escorting and protecting Allied supply ships in the Gulf, as well as the enormous task of scheduling all logistic resupply on behalf of the overall battle force commander. Food, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, stores, and provisions of every description. All these were loaded and transferred to tankers, supply ships, and warships transiting up to the staging and assembly areas in the northern Gulf. Protecteur did her part.
Decided that because I have a dedicated staff, a squadron staff, and who are extremely capable, and I'd met most of the U.S. commanders at the time, and they had got to know me over the last little while. They wanted Canada to actually coordinate all the logistic forces in the Gulf, and it was a bit of a surprise when I found out that this was what was decided, that the role not only would be individual roles for the individual ships of escort and refueling, but that Canada was being asked to coordinate all of that activity for the sum up to about 200 ships in the Gulf.
All the while, the Sea Kings from Protecteur and Athabaskan conducted non-stop patrols to keep the area clear of non-combatant shipping. One of the most important contributions made by Canada to the entire war effort was the fully staffed and equipped field hospital, which could care for up to 100 patients at a time. One Canadian field hospital, based normally at Petawawa near Ottawa, was mobilized in response to a request from British authorities. Its 550-member staff began to deploy in late January. Its purpose was to provide third-line medical treatment to British combat casualties as well as prisoners of war. Early on a Sunday morning, at about 0100 Zulu time, on February the 23rd, the much-predicted ground war began, the land battle. It was massive, decisive, and lightning quick. The last major commitment of Canadian forces came on February the 20th in support of the final act. Canadian CF-18s would join the aircraft of 9 other coalition air forces in carrying out ground attack missions. Once again, Air Transport Group conducted the long and arduous ferry missions from Germany, this time airlifting the munitions that were necessary for these missions. On March the 3rd, 7 months after the invasion, commanders of the surviving forces of the Republic of Iraq agreed to an unconditional cessation of offensive operations. This, then, outlines the limits of Canadian forces' participation in the conflict that has come to be known as the War in the Gulf. Over 5,000 personnel were involved directly, in Canada, in Germany, and in theater. Many thousands more worked long and hard to support the effort. The ships and their crews, Protecteur, Athabaskan, and Terra Nova. The aircraft, from 409 and 439 fighter squadrons in Germany and 416 in Cold Lake. The Sea Kings from 423 Squadron Shearwater. The Hercules from 435 Edmonton and 436 in Trenton. The 707 Tanker from 437 Squadron in Trenton. And the ground crews who kept them flying. The soldiers from the Royal Canadian Regiment and the Bandoos. The Royal Canadian Artillery on board the ships. The communicators from 90 Canadian Headquarters and Signals Squadron from Kingston. The doctors, nurses, and support personnel with one Canadian field hospital. The members of the Royal Canadian Engineers who stayed behind to clear mines and booby traps amidst the devastation of a free Kuwait. And hundreds of support personnel from all over the country. Dedicated service in all its forms. Sudden demands, essential roles, arduous tasks, new duties, traditional professionalism.